If you asked a typical person off the street why we're wealthier today than we were a couple hundred years ago, they would probably answer that it's because of modern technology. And they would be right. Free market competition can slash the price of a consumer good by a factor of 2 or 3, but improvements in technology can slash the price by a factor of 200 or 300, if not more. In 1776, Adam Smith launched the modern discipline of economics when he published his classic, The Wealth of Nations. And on page 1 of chapter 1, he had what is the most famous parable in all of economics, the parable of the pin maker. In it, he points out that pin makers can make about 20 pins per day by hand. But with assembly lines and machines, the output per worker is about 5,000. That's about a 250 times increase. And of course, with modern technology, that goes up even higher. Economists call this the division of labor, taking a complex job and breaking it down into simple steps. And that's how assembly lines work. If the job is simple enough, a machine can do the hard part. The parable of the pin makers has been reenacted over and over again throughout many industries such as cars and textiles. And the question is always the same. Do the benefits of cheaper products outweigh the cost of lost jobs? With the benefit of hindsight, the answer is obvious. The world is much wealthier than it used to be, even for the poorest of the poor. But if you were to read through 250 years of newspapers, you would come to the opposite conclusion, that the world was on a downward spiral in which jobs were constantly being destroyed by technology. And, to be honest, it's hard to fault observers for getting it wrong. The historian Ernst H. Gombrich explains in his very charming book, A Little History of the World, what life is like for weavers who lost their jobs to machines. He writes, "And naturally, rather than see his family starve, a person will do anything, even work for a pittance as long as that means he has a job to keep body and soul together. So the factory owner, with his machines, could summon the 100 starving weavers and say, 'I need people to run my factory and look after my machines. What will you charge for that?' One of them might say, 'I want so much if I am to live as comfortably as I did before.' And the next would say, 'I just need enough for a loaf of bread and a kilo of potatoes a day.' And the third, seeing his last chance of survival about to disappear, would say, 'I'll see if I can manage on half a loaf.' 4 others then said, 'So will we.' 'Right,' said the factory owner, 'I'll take you 5. How many hours can you work in a day?' 10 hours, said the first. 12, said the second, seeing the job slipping from his grasp. 'I can do 16, cried the third, for his life depended on it. And that's the essential problem that workers faced during the Industrial Revolution, which is workers were losing jobs faster than standards of living were rising. And this problem gave rise to the Luddite movement. These days, the word Luddite suggests people who don't like smartphones and social media and grumble about modern life. But during the Industrial Revolution, the Luddite movement was about survival. The Luddites were a group of English textile workers who broke into factories and destroyed the machines that cost them their jobs. This happened all the time during the Industrial Revolution. An engineer would invent a new machine, and angry workers would promptly destroy it. They didn't want their labor saved, they wanted jobs. Karl Marx had a more revolutionary vision. He claimed that it was futile to stop progress. Instead of destroying machines, the workers needed to take ownership of them. That way everyone could enjoy the benefits of progress instead of just a few rich capitalists. But history has proven that Marx was wrong and that socialism only produces grinding poverty and oppression. The Black Book of Communism estimates that 100 million people were killed during the 20th century because of communism, and that doesn't count people who just starved to death or died because of preventable diseases. So how did Marx go wrong? Why did capitalism win and communism lose? Well, that's going to be a running theme through all these economics videos, but one part of that question we can answer right now. Think back to the parable of the price gougers after the hurricane. Now, if you recall from the previous video, after a hurricane in Virginia, contractors from nearby states moved all their heavy equipment to help clean up the storm damage. And they didn't do it out of altruism, they did it for money. They did it to cash in on windfall profits. There was a lot of pent-up demand created by hurricane damage, and so there was windfall profits to be made for the first few contractors to get their equipment to Virginia. But after a whole bunch of contractors got their equipment there, the supply would rise, which would result in a drop in price. And then eventually all that pent-up demand would be met, and the contractors came back home. And that's exactly how technological innovations work. So in the case of the price gougers and the hurricane, The hurricane caused an initial shock. In the case of technology, a technological improvement causes the initial shock. So imagine that you're the first pin factory, and now you can make pins way cheaper than anybody else. So you undercut existing pin makers and you largely corner the market, and now you're making windfall profits. But other people are going to see exactly what you're doing, and they're going to make their own pin factories. And then they're going to enter the market, and now you've got 2 pin factories competing. And someone else will enter the market, and then you've got 3 or 4 or 5 and more pin factories competing. And this will progressively drive the price down until it settles into a new equilibrium based on how much cheaper they are to make. So pins become available for much, much less money. That's how capitalism results in cheap consumer goods. However, there is still a group that clearly lost. The old workers who made textiles or pins or whatever by hand and who now don't have a job. And so this shifts to a new question. Is the benefit of cheaper consumer goods worth the price of so many people losing their jobs? And once again, the answer is yes. Think about it this way. Suppose modern technology makes everything we want to buy cost 1/10 as much as it is before. Then that's equivalent to making everybody 10 times as wealthy as they used to be. So people have to do things with that extra wealth, and that extra wealth goes into new uses to create new goods or new services, and people find jobs in these new markets. The economist Jospher Schumpeter calls this process creative destruction. New innovations cause inefficient firms to go out of business, and it causes skills to become obsolete. And creative destruction can even destroy entire markets, such as the market for horse and buggies that got destroyed by cars, and the market for COBOL programmers that got destroyed by C and Java programmers. And so the consequence is lost jobs. In the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics, Richard Alm and W. Michael Cox document some of these transformations. In 1920, there were 2.1 million Americans working in the railroad industry, compared to only 200,000 today. And in 1910, nearly 12 million Americans worked as farmers, compared to only 716,000 today. That's the destructive side of the process, but there's also the creative side of the process. So today there are over 2 million engineers compared to only 38,000 in 1910, and there are over 4 million truck, taxi, and bus drivers, but none in 1900. So jobs are always getting destroyed, and jobs are always being created. And that means that creative destruction is not a gentle process, but it is a necessary one. Without it, we'd be stuck with yesterday's technology and yesterday's standard of living. I don't think anyone would want to raise their kids with the standard of living that people had back in the 1700s, where medical technology and food was so bad that most children grew up with stunted growth and a large percentage of children died before reaching adulthood. And if you want hard statistics, here they are. In the greatest century that ever was, the economists Stephen Moore and Julian L. Simon documented some of the major advances just in the 20th century. Inflation-adjusted per capita GDP increased from 4,800 to 31,000, car ownership increased from 1% to 91%, and the poverty rate fell from 40% to 12%, and the length of the average work week fell from 50 hours to 35 hours. However, I don't want to undersell the difficulty of creative destruction. The fact of the matter is, some people are going to lose their jobs, and they are just going to have to face a permanent loss of income because of it. In 2019, Joseph Biden told coal miners that they should learn to code. But that's not a realistic option to most people. And also, as a little tangent, the reason why he told the coal miners to learn to code was so that we could replace our coal infrastructure with green energy, and that's part of the reason why our energy rates have actually been rising, at least in blue states. And, as another tangent to that Joseph Biden anecdote, the onset of new AI technologies is rapidly destroying computer programming jobs. So the advice that he gave of learning how to code means that people would be entering a career that right now is withering and possibly dying. Intelligent and sophisticated leftists always claim that the government can play a role picking winners in the economy, and yet learn to code has been something of a slogan in the leftist community over the past 10, 15, 20 years, and it's bad advice. But I am enough of an old-school Democrat that I do think the government has a role to play with helping people transition careers and getting some education. Learning how to code may not be an option for everyone, but people can go back to school and become an electrician or find some other trade job, maybe in the medical field. creative destruction teaches what is arguably the single most important conservative lesson, and it's one of the reasons why Democrats and Republicans have such different intuitions looking at the same evidence. And that lesson is the virtue of failure. Even when technology isn't changing, markets are in a constant state of flux. Sometimes firms just lose their mojo. They get a CEO who lacks vision, they adopt a harmful management technique like stack rank, or they do something to ruin their workplace culture, or they just bet on some bad products. But other hungry firms will fill that void, and the market as a whole stays competitive. So free market competition is just like survival of the fittest. Animals with bad genes that can't run fast don't survive, but this means that the species as a whole stays fit. Now, I wouldn't want to have to suffer from failures in a context of life and death, like an animal running away from predators, but in virtually every other context, failure teaches valuable lessons. Failure is the greatest teacher that we have. And I wish I could include the whole commercial, but I think I'll get hit with a fair use claim. But one of the best commercials of all time was the Nike commercial with Michael Jordan called Failure. And in the commercial, he narrates some of the low points of his career. He says, "I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed." Now, the interesting thing about this commercial is that Michael actually had to fight with Nike to get it made. They had teamed him up with the director Oliver Stone, and he wanted to make a commercial highlighting Jordan's successes. And it was Jordan himself who pushed back on it. He said, "The idea is to tell young kids, don't be afraid to fail, because a lot of people have to fail to be successful. There are many times that I've failed, and yet I've been successful." Islands also give us insight into the virtue of failure. Now, I'm probably going to talk about islands a few times over this video series, and it's important to understand that islands are weird for a lot of reasons, like founder effects and reduced biodiversity. But one of the most important factors about islands is that natural selection is weaker. So take birds. There are two main reasons why birds fly. One reason is to escape predators, and the other reason is to find foods. But islands have few natural predators and easy food sources. So on islands, you often find flightless birds like dodos and kiwis. So flightlessness doesn't happen instantly. It's a gradual process. So birds may fly quite a bit when they get to an island, but flying is very energetically expensive. So a bird that chooses to fly less may actually be healthier and better fed by not having to engage in this metabolically expensive process of flight. It can just walk around on the ground and eat everything it wants and only occasionally fly. And so as this happens, the birds will become less and less suited to flight until ultimately they can't fly at all. So the island acts like a breeder, favoring the birds that put their time and energy into getting more and more food over the birds that put their time and energy into flying. And over many generations, that results in the loss of flight. At the risk of getting too poetic for an economics video, I wonder what it's like for these earthbound birds that used to be able to fly. My dog twitches his legs when he dreams of chasing squirrels, and I wonder, do kiwi birds twitch their vestigial wings and dream of flight? If you're an economically sophisticated listener, you may be banging your head through the first part of this video, and you may be pointing out that there's a very important difference between making pins by hand and having factories that make pins. When everybody can make pins by hand, there's clearly enough competition to keep one firm from cornering the market and then raising prices for everyone else. But after assembly lines, there may only be 2 or 3 factories making pins, and so what's to stop them from maybe colluding and then raising prices and gouging customers? And if that's the case, then the benefits of technological improvement will be captured by the rich factory owners and not the average consumer. Historically, the case for free markets has been based on the assumption of perfect competition. And that only happens when the following 4 assumptions are met. Number 1, there are many buyers and sellers of a good. Number 2, the barriers to entry into the market are low or non-existent. Number 3, the goods produced by different firms are essentially identical. And number 4, consumers are acting with perfect information about the prices and quantities of goods being sold. Perfect competition is completely ruthless. It is impossible for firms in a perfectly competitive market to gouge consumers, because some other firm will come along and undercut them. Even if they somehow included every single firm into the cartel that's colluding to gouge consumers, the barriers to entry are low, so someone else could just enter the market and undercut the cartel a little bit. And if they get brought into the cartel, then someone else will enter the market and do it. So if one firm makes a profit of just 2%, some other firm will come along and charge prices so that they only make a profit of 1%, and then 0.5%. And eventually profits are driven down to essentially zero. And if you're wondering how people make money with zero profits, there would be a salary for the owners and for the workers, but there would be no share of the profits as a percentage. This makes a very easy argument for liberals who do not like free markets, which is that there are virtually no markets in the entire economy that are even remotely like this. The closest that we get is commodities like gold and pork bellies and hard red winter wheat number 2. And in these markets, there are hundreds or thousands of producers all making an identical product. If a farmer sells his hard red winter wheat number 2 for even a penny more than another farmer, he'll lose the entire market to his rival and he won't sell a single bushel. But in the real world, these assumptions are not true, and that gives us imperfect competition. And imperfect competition gives firms what economists call either monopoly power or market power. And note that monopoly power does not mean they have a true monopoly, it just means they have some degree of power over the market and some ability to set prices above the cost of manufacture. Popular mythologies of imperfect competition evokes images of robber barons of the 1800s who exploited consumers. But in reality, these entrepreneurs were innovators who found ways to lower prices. Standard Oil is the textbook example, so let's spend a little bit of time on them. The economist Thomas DiLorenzo debunks some of the myths about Standard Oil in his book, How Capitalism Saved America. So the first thing to understand is that back in the late 1800s, the oil industry was going through a boom period. The Industrial Revolution was ramping up and everyone knew that oil was huge. So investors threw money at oil companies. And if you can remember the dot-com boom of the late 90s, then it was basically the exact same way. Everyone wanted to get into the dot-com boom because they were hoping to get a share of the profits that firms were making. Everyone knew that firms like Google and Amazon were going to emerge from this crucible of competition. They just didn't know which ones. So everybody was hoping that they could be the next Google, and everyone was hoping that they could make this money, even though they knew that most of them would not. And that's exactly how it was in Standard Oil's time. One of these seemingly minor players in the oil market was Standard Oil. In 1870, it only had 4% of the market. But John D. Rockefeller had a vision that separated him from his competitors. So the first plank of his strategy was to improve both the safety and efficiency of the refining process. Oil refineries used to be very dangerous and they were prone to massive fires. Standard Oil instituted better quality control and it made manufacturing safer and cheaper. So this was good for the safety of workers, but it was also good for the profits of Standard Oil. Then Rockefeller began to buy competitors. And critics will say that this is proof of their predatory ways, but again, remember the context. Everyone knew that there were too many firms and that they were all too small. And so what J.D. Rockefeller did was he brought them all under unified management, was able to leverage economies of scale, and bring his own innovative processes to these other firms. Another improvement Standard Oil made was to vertically integrate, which means that they made other products needed to sell and distribute oil, such as the barrels that stored the oil and the wagons that carried them. Now, vertical integration, particularly in modern times, is not always a great strategy, but if you're really ahead of the curve, then it can be a beneficial strategy because you can make all your suppliers more efficient if you just take care of that role yourself rather than relying on third parties. And that's exactly what Standard Oil did. So the textbook example of this is they reduced the number of rivets in an oil barrel from 60 to 59, which is a tiny change, but it saved a lot of money when you're selling millions of barrels of oil every year. One of their most important changes was that they hired chemists to make other products from the waste oil left over from refining. So back then everyone wanted kerosene for lights. It was before electric lights. But they came up with a bunch of other products, including lubricating oil, paint, and another little-known product called gasoline that I'm sure had no future. If you put all these innovations together, the results are just extraordinary. In 1869, the year before Standard Oil was formed, Refined oil cost 30 cents per gallon. By 1885, Standard Oil had improved its market share to 85%, while dropping the price of refined oil to 8 cents per gallon. As a small tangent, the true story of Standard Oil is a good heuristic for evaluating historians. A lot of times you'll be reading a book by a historian and it seems to be very thorough and even-handed, and then you get to the Gilded Age and all it does is talk about how the trusts like Standard Oil were exploiting consumers. And then you know that the historian has been biased. Fears of Standard Oil's monopoly power were unfounded. It's really hard to stay ahead of the competition forever. Standard Oil's market share peaked at about 88% in 1890, and then it went into a decline. By the time the Supreme Court upheld the Sherman antitrust decision against Standard Oil in 1911, its market share had already dropped to 64%. So, did Standard Oil reap windfall profits along the way? Absolutely. And they should. They were innovative, they deserve those windfall profits. That's the market working exactly the way it should. Windfall profits are an incentive for entrepreneurs to create new products or to make existing products much less expensively. And as the competition ramps up and more people rip off their successful techniques, the competition increases, their market share declines, and their profits go down. And that's exactly what happened to Standard Oil. The only group that didn't win was Standard Oil's competitors. So the economist Thomas DiLorenzo, who wrote the book How Capitalism Saved America, did a lot of research on the trust era of economic history. And he studied all the cases where firms were charged by the Sherman Antitrust Act. And what he found was that these so-called monopoly firms were actually dropping prices faster than the industry average. So the takeaway is that firms that cannot compete in the marketplace use the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up their competitors because maybe they can win in the legal arena even if they can't make goods quite as cheaply. So the takeaway from this is that perfect competition only exists in a stagnant world with no technological change. So standards of living are never going to rise, your children won't have a better life than you did, nothing's going to improve for the better in a world of perfect competition. And as Standard Oil shows, fears about monopolies are overstated. They never hit 100%, they hit 88% market share. And by the time the Supreme Court ruled against them on the Sherman Antitrust Act, they had already declined to 64% market share. So market forces take care of most of these problems for us. So that makes a good stopping point for this video. The next video is really going to get into the science and the mechanics of monopolies and imperfect competition in general. It will cover one of my favorite topics, monopolistic competition, which is markets where the goods by one firm are different than the goods by another firm, like how McDonald's and Wendy's have slightly different versions of the same goods. And we'll get into network monopolies, which are a special type of monopoly created by consumer demand rather than by one firm being unusually efficient.